been in a series about love, which Charles Fillmore calls the great harmonizing faculty. So loving our bodies, loving ourselves, loving our lives. Today, we're going to talk about loving our neighbors and loving our God. Love your neighbor, love your God. It sounds pretty simple and it sounds fairly easy, but what does it really mean? What does it mean to love our neighbors and to love them as ourselves? And what does it mean to love your God? Is loving your God just about praising, just about worshiping, just about praying or meditating? Or is it about activating a sacred consciousness and emanating that holy light, radiating that energy to the world around us? This idea of loving our neighbors comes up through world traditions. Yet it seems to be one of the most difficult parts of the human condition. For whatever reason, human beings seem to separate themselves from each other and polarize due to differences. And when that polarization happens, there is not a harmonizing. And we don't often experience or see the presence of love, because people tend to see through eyes that say, not me, not mine, not concerned, not part of what I include in what I love. But how can we profess to love God, or whatever your understanding of God is, whether it's energy or love itself or the great universe, or that undefined, unknown that simply is? How can we honor what we are and what God is when we reject God's seed, when we reject life itself? I want to share with you a clip. I have the honor of hosting AG&T Speaks, which is a weekly dialogue with our leaders from the Association for Global New Thought, a board that I serve on. And they're incredible leaders. And this week I got to talk to Reverend Dr. Michael Beckwith, and he gave us a conversation to sit with this week that had to do with the Season for Nonviolence theme of care and compassion. And he gave us a deep look into what compassion really means. He went through sympathy, he went through empathy, and he shared a personal story on awakening and on healing. So I want to share that with you today.
So sympathy would say, I know how you feel. Empathy says, I'll feel for you. Compassion says, I'm seeking to alleviate suffering. I'm not trying to get into your emotional content. I'm seeking to alleviate suffering. So compassion has different tentacles to it, but it's a really high state of love. I can remember when I was a Boy Scout. Me and my friend Reggie were on our way home from a Boy Scout meeting. He later changed his name to Nirvana, and people probably know him as Reverend Nirvana Gale. But we were little kids. We were in the Boy Scouts together. And on the way home, we saw this smoke coming out of this house. And we rushed, we could see there was a fire in the house, and there was a man laying on this couch unconscious, and dogs were barking. And so we tried to wake him up. We couldn't wake him up. So we went to a couple of neighbors, and finally a neighbor allowed us to come in. And then obviously this is way before cell phones and all that kind of technology. And a neighbor allowed us to go in the house, and we called the fire department. We ran back to where the fire was, and we were directing the fire department to where the fire was. And, we're little kids, and we're thinking, oh my God, we're going to get a Boy Scout pin for this. And, we're saving somebody's life and all of this. And when the fireman jumped off the fire truck, he looked at us, he said, get out of the way, you little, then he called us the N-word, get out of the way. Oh. And so we're like 12 and 13 years old. We're like so vulnerable, we're so open. And he's, get out of the way. And we stayed there long enough to see them break down the door, bring the guy out on a stretcher, saved the dogs, and put out the fire. And so on the way home, Reggie and I, we didn't say anything. We were like in shock. But by the time we got home, we had torn off our Boy Scout patches and we never went back to another Boy Scout meeting. And it birthed within us this like a fire of activism. Like we had to change the world some kind of way. First it was out of anger. We're 12, 13 years old, and then it grew.
The world can be harsh. Hearing that story from Reverend Michael was heartbreaking. And you really, when you picture him as a young boy and you picture his friend being helpful and doing something so beautiful and good and knowing what they were doing, knowing how important what they were doing was, and to be treated in that way. He went on in the time together to share his healing work around that he did healing work and thought it was complete, and that later on in life it came back to him. In another experience, he said he was in a healing meditation practice, and the invitation was to call upon anyone known or unknown to us that we may have forgiveness work with. So he said, if there is anyone I need to forgive, or anyone who needs to forgive me, please let them show up in my awareness. And when he did, the firemen showed up. And he said that it was a moment where he was brought into a different experience. All of a sudden, he said, he was in his body looking at the world as this man saw it, just looking from a whole different perspective. And he got that gift of being able to see through that man's eyes. And he said he could see that his world was very small, that his entire life was lived in a bigoted, racist, sexist world, and imagining that you can't be happy in that world. And then he said this, he said, I could see the world that he was living in, and my heart burst with compassion. I could see the world that he was living in, and my heart burst with compassion. Now, so often human beings have the experience of this harsh world. And rather than using these as a stepping stone, as Michael Beckwith has done in his life, to create more love, to create more God on earth, to create more healing, for many people, it closes them down. But can we activate compassion in our world? Can we look at the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion and dive into compassion, dive into an intention to alleviate the suffering? So rather than thinking about, I need to treat my neighbor as myself, that means I need to love them, that means I need to like them how they are, enjoy how they are. Instead, if we could take a step in the direction of compassion and open our hearts to understanding that maybe I can take that first step of seeing you and seeing how, when from your perspective, when living in your world, you might show up in the way you do. When I do that, there is an opportunity for great healing. Forgiveness happens. Compassion happens. And I would say God happens when we do that. There was another story that was shared with me this week that was so compelling, so powerful. It was about a woman who had two sons, and one of her sons came to her one day with the son's experience that they're not, in fact, a son, that they're a daughter, that they feel more like a female than a male. And this woman vulnerably shared her experience as a parent and as a woman of spirit, a spiritual woman, on what it was like to have this awakening, have this processing, and have this healing, and what she did. This interview was done by MJ, Malcolm Harris, who does incredible interviews and does incredible gifted sharing for healing. And in this story, she was saying that when her teen son became her daughter, her first knowing was that she needed to accept her, to just dive into acceptance, that this was her seed and she was not going to reject her seed. So for as much as she didn't know what was coming, for as much as she didn't feel like she had the skills or the resources to navigate this, she knew she would, and she knew she would be there. She knew abandonment was not a possibility, that instead coming closer together was the only option. And it said one of the first things, it said that what she said is one of the first things that she did, which is really a devastating measure of our society. It's just like so sad, but so wise on her end. But what she did was she said, at this time, in the place she was living, she knew the environment, she knew the school system, she knew the community. And she said the first thing she did was take her child out of school. The first thing she did was take her child out of school. Now, how awful is it that that is and was for her at that moment the wisest choice for supporting her child? That where she was living at the time, the school system, that she knew if this child was going to have this experience here, that her beautiful child would be torn apart and destroyed, would be mocked, humiliated, and would enter the world of hate, the harsh realities of the human condition. In her deep desire to help her child and asking that question, how do I help my child? How do I help my child? She said a couple of things emerged for her. The first was, when someone shows you who they are, believe them, accept them. When someone shows you who they are, believe them and accept them. And then she said that as she took her child out of school, she got her child a tutor, she got a therapist to work with that child, to build her up so that she would be strong, so that she would know who she was, so that she would not miss what was important, and that she would build her self-confidence, her sense of self from within, not from the harsh experience of the world around her. The conversation around suicide came up, which is so common with young ones going through the struggle, and with anyone struggling with the harshness of the world. But she didn't stop there in her question of, how do I help my child? How do I support my child and ensure that my child will thrive, even in the midst of this, when I know the world we live in and the neighbors we're surrounded by? And what she got in her inquiry was this: she went to a meditation experience, and her mantra she got was acceptance, love and acceptance. So she worked with that, and she worked with that. And she said that what she came to was that her work was within. Her work was within. She knew that her God would never turn its back on her, and she would never turn her back on her child. And she knew that God had prepared her for this. And she stopped then saying, why me? And began saying, why not me? And she began seeing the gift, not seeing this as a problem, but began to see the beauty and the magnificence of her divine child in a way that was shifting and changing, yes, but nonetheless was the wholeness and the beauty of her beloved child. In the interview towards the end, MJ talked about his own experience with his mother coming out as a Black gay male. And he said that his mother kind of talked about how she, there wasn't a roadmap. She didn't know how to do this, but that she was here with him, that she was here and to go easy on her because this is uncharted territory, but they're in it together. And it was a beautiful moment. And what he said was that none of us are perfect, but we can have a perfect commitment to love. None of us are perfect and none of us get a roadmap, but we can have a perfect commitment to love. Our commitment to love hinges on our ability to show up with a level of care and compassion, with some mastery of sympathy and empathy and understanding, even when we don't share an experience. She went directly to the source of her being, and she realized that a lot of what needed to be healed was her own self-confidence, her own issues around being different, being a different family, being seen differently. And she did that work. She did that work because it was in her heart to do that work, because she was not going to let the heart that is outside of her body, in her daughter's body, go around getting hurt because she was not healed or whole. Are we perpetuating a culture of hate or a culture of love and acceptance? Are we honoring the God of our understanding with giving compassion to its seed? One of the things that struck me in the video is just that she kept saying, how could you abandon your seed? You don't abandon your seed. You water it, you nourish it, you love it. When asked by MJ what advice she could give to young ones out there struggling, she gave advice to all of us. She gave advice to all of us. She said, when this lifetime is over, what did you do with the seed you were given? When you're reflecting, when your lifetime is over, and you ask yourself, what did you do with the seed you were given? What will your answer be? What will my answer be? Did we love it? Did we water it? Did we nourish it? Did we have compassion? Or did we dry it up? Did we abandon it? And friends, our seed is not just our children. Our seed is this living universe with every human being in it. Who else out there is so tired of talking about rights as if they're not all human rights? As if they're not all just human rights. When you get into a spiritual practice, you recognize that loving your neighbor as yourself and loving your God with all your heart means loving all of the seeds of creation. And that doesn't have to mean that in a moment you like what you see, but it means that in a moment you pray for the divine understanding, you pray for your communion with your God, so that you may birth compassion that heals and harmonizes, rather than the polarization and the harshness that causes and creates suffering. The author Emmanuel says, you cannot possibly, through your mind cannot possibly understand God. Your heart already knows. Your heart already knows, which gives us a key. The key is to dive into your heart. Get out of the mind. The mind can be shaped. The mind can be contorted. The mind can be limited. But our hearts are where the communion happens. In the end of the interview, she said that pain comes from lack of love for self. Pain comes from lack of love for yourself. And her advice was love yourself and go get healing. That's what she said. Love yourself and go get healing. She went into another little beautiful part about God, and she said, how can you want God to love and accept you? How can you be in the space of that and then not love and accept your seed? So friends, if the seed is all around us, then loving our neighbor is loving our God, and loving our God is loving our neighbor. And neither of those can happen if we do not love ourselves, not fully and completely. You know, a lot of times when people are growing in awareness around diversity, People will use the phrase that I don't see this difference anymore. I don't see it anymore. What if we can just use that as a stepping stone? And rather than saying we don't see that, whether it is orientation or whether it is race or whether it is religion, I don't see that anymore. If we can in fact see it and celebrate it. If we can in fact see it, acknowledge it, honor it, and find the God in it so that it will bless us. To acknowledge that we don't have to not see things in order to show up as love. That in fact, we can see everything. We can even see some of the harshest things. We can even see some of the most disturbing things and enter a spiritual place where we are moved by compassion. Because we have divine understanding, not human understanding, but divine understanding. And that draws us to a higher place. Everyone that's done any sort of inner work has gone through a process of healing in their relationships, of forgiveness work for whatever relationships they had. I was on with Reverend Dr. Temple Hayes, one of my AG&T colleagues, for AG&T Speaks a few weeks ago. And she said something that I kind of chuckled at, but she said, when you turn 30, like if you're 30, after you're 30, you no longer get to blame your reality on your parents. You no longer get to blame your stuff on your parents. Like once you turn 30, you just don't get to play that card anymore. And I just kind of chuckled and thought about it and thought about all of the work that happens around our conditioning and around our conditions and around forgiveness. Because it's time for each one of us to take inventory, to do our own healing work and to take responsibility for it. It doesn't mean that things didn't happen, that things don't happen. It doesn't mean that there aren't issues in the world around us. But it means that it is part of our spiritual practice to take what feels like is stepping on us and use it as a stepping stone. To not allow part of our story to become a limitation, but to, in fact, turn it around so it lifts us off into the limitless. Because our stories are as good as what we do with them. I think sometimes about what's going on, electricity going out in the bitter cold, a pandemic, masks, no masks, a virus, fires, climate change, no climate change. Fill in the blank, the intensities of life. We're being prepared to care for each other at a higher level. We're being prepared to care for each other at a higher level. The Buddhists teach that life is suffering. In unity, a lot of our practice kind of seems like the opposite. It's like find the joy, find the good. Some of the suffering is unavoidable. So much of it we cause. So much of it we are responsible for and we co-create. So what are we going to make for the future? We're being prepared to care for each other on a higher level. Are we the people that will help each other overcome adversity and overcome difficulties? Have we developed the community that can sustain hardship? We've recently seen one of the craziest political climates of our lifetime. And we're in the midst of one of the most interesting experiences. What are we made of? What are we made of? And how are we showing up for it as individuals and as a collective? I do think it needs some work. And I think we have time to lift it. So can we imagine for a moment that on some level we may have made an agreement to be here at this time and space right now for exactly what's happening, both in our collective lives and in our individual lives. On some level, that we knew we had everything we needed for this part of the journey. Our ability to show up for our journey, both individually and collectively, hinges on our ability to show up with compassion, with care and compassion, with some mastery of sympathy and empathy, especially when we don't have the experience, especially when we can't share the experience, especially when we can't say, I've been there. Do you want to have to go through everything that other people go through in order to really have your heart open? I don't want to. I want to move through what is mine. And I want people around me that love and support me, that trust me and learn how to be there for me and learn how to make the world a better place for people that experience whatever I experience. And the same thing with every single one of our neighbors. You know, this part that I'm going to say, this isn't a political commentary at all. But one of the things I love about Bernie Sanders, so we're not talking about voting, we're talking about consciousness. One of the things I love about Bernie Sanders is that he has a way of being in a room full of people that are full of suffering, discord, and polarization, and opening them up by speaking right to the heart, by breathing compassion into the room, bringing compassion into the room so fully that a different experience happens and a different conversation happens so that real healing can happen. Can we bring compassion with us? And where are the places and spaces in our lives that need more compassion? Again, it doesn't mean that we're stepped on. It doesn't mean that we all become the same. But it means that we want to honor the seed of God. The Buddha said, imagine that every person in the world is enlightened but you. Imagine that every person in the world is enlightened but you. They are all your teachers, each doing just the right thing to help you learn perfect patience, perfect wisdom, perfect compassion. Breathe into that for a moment. What are your teachers right now? Who is teaching you? Not the teacher you think you signed up for, not the one you think you want, but the one who is really teaching you right now. Are we ready to love our neighbors and love our God? Claudia Michelle said, everywhere I look, I see myself. There I go, that bald man, this angry child, that fearful cat, that cool stone, that babbling brook, that worm struggling for its life, that bird desperate to feed her hungry babies, that one trapped in his rage, this one anxious but fearful of finding out why. Hardly strangers. Empathy is the life of the soul, I think, because the soul that allows us to see the one in the other is the soul that finds joy. Remember the words from Michael Beckwith. He said, sympathy says, I know how you feel. Empathy says, I'll feel for you. Compassion says, I'm seeking to alleviate suffering. That mother in the story that I told earlier was committed to doing whatever it takes on the outside and whatever it takes on the inside to heal her own lack of wholeness and to build up an inner world so that there would not be more pain and suffering in the outer world. And I do think that she's on a mission now to help heal the world of closed-heartedness and closed-mindedness, and to invite people into the wholeness of God. Are we willing to do what it takes? Are we willing to do our work, to really ask when things trigger us, when things bother us, when we have a story about someone or something, to say, this is God's seed, sweet spirit, show me my healing. Show me my healing so that I might breathe compassion into this room of life, into this space within, that I might be the great harmonizing faculty in action, love. That I might love myself, that I might love my neighbors, that I might love my God. May all beings have freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings know they're born blessed and here to be a blessing. May all beings know God as love and themselves as emanations of this love. Namaste.